Well, congratulations. You made it to the fourth GI online lecture. I'm very proud of you. This is a very long chapter. Today, we are going to discuss the physiology of digestion and absorption. And just so you know, we're not going to go into the deep biochemistry. You can go through that when you take biochemistry and cell biology. But I want to give you an overview of what takes place in the small intestine as far as digestion and absorption takes place. Let's recall that the small intestine has three segments. From the stomach to the large intestine, those are in order: the duodenum, and this is where the pancreatic juice and the bile dump into the small intestine. We have the jejunum and the ileum. Remember that it's the ileum that has the ileocecal valve that connects the small intestine into the large intestine. So here we go. When you think about digestion, I want you to think about that when you eat something, say a piece of pizza, all the different macromolecules that are in that piece of pizza. So my favorite pizza is the all meat pizza, and what I like, take a big bite out of that. So think about your favorite pizza or your favorite food, take a big bite out of it, and think about what's taking place. So you have mechanical digestion in the mouth, as well as you're going to have chemical digestion. Remember that salivary amylase is produced by the salivary glands, and this is going to start breaking up the polysaccharides, so the big complex carbohydrates. You swallow, it goes down the esophagus into the stomach, it goes bloop, and then that bolus is going to undergo more mechanical digestion as the stomach churns and moves everything around, as well as chemical digestion. So when we look at the chemical digestion in the stomach, we're looking at pepsin, we're looking at HCl, and those are our chemical components. So pepsin's going to break down protein. There's a little bit of lipase in the stomach that breaks down lipids, but most of that's going to take place in the small intestines. So it's in the small intestines where the final chemical digestion takes place and the nutrients are absorbed. So when we look at this, digestion is going to break down foods from polymers to their monomers. And so we're going to go from complex carbohydrates into the monomers, glucose and fructose, galactose, for example. Only the monomers are going to be small enough to be able to be absorbed across the small intestine wall into the intestinal cells, cross the intestinal cells, and then be absorbed into the capillary system. Okay, remember that hydrolysis, that's important. All right, let's look at this picture, look at the mechanism of absorption, and you can see that, all right, Brinkley wants in. You can see that at the apical membrane of the epithelium in the small intestine, remember these are columnar epithelial cells, you see the brush border. It's where enzymes are located. Once those polymers are broken down into monomers, the monomers are going to physically cross through the epithelial cells and then be absorbed into the capillary system. So those monomers that get absorbed into the blood physically cross the epithelial tissue in the small intestine. So let's look at how these are processed. How are these nutrients processed? We're going to go macromolecule by macromolecule. So carbohydrates, remember, begin as complex carbs and starch, and then they have to be broken down into oligosaccharides, disaccharides, and then eventually into the monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose. You need to know those three monomers. Make sure you know those three monomers: glucose, fructose, and galactose. So the starch will be broken down into lactose, maltose, and sucrose. These are the three main disaccharides. And then the lactose will be broken down into its monomers by the enzyme lactase. Maltose will be broken down into its monomers by the enzyme maltase. And sucrose, that's table sugar, will be broken down into its monomers by sucrase. Notice here that the monosaccharides go through the epithelial cell by facilitated diffusion, and then they enter the capillary blood and are transported to hepatic portal system. Got that? It's passive, okay, facilitated diffusion, and they go to the hepatic portal system. Where does the hepatic portal system go? You're absolutely right. It goes to the liver. Woohoo! Carbs are digested very quickly and thus do not satisfy our hunger for long. The word you want to use is being satiated or satiation, and that means you're full and you're content. Since carbs are digested so fast and absorbed so quickly, we get hungry quickly after a high carbohydrate meal. Mechanical digestion of all foodstuffs begins in the mouth. Are going to travel across the epithelial cells and into the blood capillaries, What about lipids? Remember that lipid digestion begins in the stomach with the gastric lipase, but only about 15% of the lipids will be broken down, if that much. Because lipids do not mix with water, okay, we can't use hydrolysis. So the lipids have to be emulsified. And basically what this means is that the bile salts are going to break down the bonds so that the fat globules are turned into smaller globules. And these small globules are going to be called micelles. Micelles. I know it doesn't look like that, but that's the way it's pronounced, micelles. So once these micelles are available, then the pancreatic lipases can break down the fat into the monoglyceride plus 2 free fatty acids. Stop and think about, what is the structure of a lipid? Remember, it's got a glyceride, and it has at least 2 fatty acid tails, sometimes 3, but mainly 2. And so the lipases can split the fatty acids away from the monoglyceride. When we look at this, we see that the lipids, okay, are going to the monoglyceride, 2 fatty acids. These are going to leave the micelles. They cross the epithelial membrane by diffusion, and then they enter the lacteals. The lacteals, not the capillaries, the lacteals. And remember that the lacteals, then are part of the lymph system. The lymph system is going to dump the lymph carrying fats back into the blood at the heart, and this is how then the fat will then be distributed throughout the body for processing. So when we look at fat digestion and protein digestion, these take a lot longer. These molecules take longer to be processed in the stomach. They take longer to be processed in the small intestine. And so we have a feeling of being satiated or being full. That's why you can go eat one of my favorite foods, tamales, and be full the rest of the afternoon until 6 or 7 at night, because there's plenty of protein and fat in them, and it takes longer for our stomach and our intestines to break that down, so we feel full. If I go eat one of my other foods, such as chicken fried rice, then there's a lot of rice and not very many proteins, and after a couple hours, I'm hungry again, because all those carbs have been processed very rapidly through the stomach and into the small intestine. When you look at this chart, look at the fat digestion. So it goes from triglycerides, fats, into monoglycerides and fatty acids. So what are the monomers of the triglycerides, of the fats? The monomers are monoglyceride and fatty acids. Monoglyceride and fatty acids. There is a lingual lipase. It does very little. The gastric lipase doesn't do much more, but the real digestion takes place in the small intestine because of the products of bile, which contains bile salts, and pancreatic lipases. Pancreatic lipases. Make sure you spend time and go through this flow chart. I like this picture because it shows you how emulsification takes place. So you got a fat globule that's in the small intestine. Bile has been dumped into the duodenum, and you have bile salts that attach to the fat globule. And so these bile salts then are going to break up the big fat globule into itty-bitty fat globules called micelles. These micelles are small enough that pancreatic lipases can hydrolyze. Okay, the bile salts bring in some water, but they can hydrolyze the triglycerides into monoglycerides and free fatty acids. And then we have the fatty acids and the monoglycerides, glycerides diffuse from the micelles into the epithelial tissue, the columnar epithelial tissue, and from the columnar epithelial tissue forms what are called chylomicrons, okay? And this is just packaging of the monomers so that they can be transported through the epithelial tissue and out into the lacteal, And if we look at this, remember that the chylomicrons are going to be spit out, exocytosed by the epithelial cells. So the epithelial cells are going tooey, 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 fat, icky, tooey, tooey, and spitting it out into the lacteals. The lacteals are going, I love fat. Give me. All right. Where on God's green earth are you getting nucleic acids? Well, are you eating protein? Those are cells. You got cells, you got eukaryotic cells, you got nucleic acid. Maybe you're taking in some viruses and bacteria at the same time. they have nucleic acid. So everything pretty much has DNA and RNA, except for red blood cells. So the pancreatic nucleases hydrolyze nucleic acids into the monomers. Yay! Which organ produces pancreatic nucleases? Yay! Pancreas! In the small intestine, at the brush borders, then we have the enzymes nucleosidases and phosphatases. And these are going to break the nucleotides down into the nitrogen base, the pentose sugars, and the phosphate ions. These are going to be actively transported. Pay attention, actively transported across the epithelium, into the epithelial cells, and then eventually into the capillary blood system, where it's transported to the liver via the hepatic portal system, and now your liver can make DNA and RNA. It makes it in the cells. You ever wonder where the where the nucleotides come from so that your cells can make DNA and RNA? It comes from everything being processed in the liver and, small intestine, transported to the liver, and then transported to your tissues. Ain't God cool like that? That is so cool. You need to stop and just ponder how God did this. This is amazing. What about all those vitamins you take? Well, there are two types of vitamins. Fat soluble, in other words, they have to be carried by missiles, by fat, to be able to be absorbed, and then water soluble. Water soluble are absorbed by diffusion or passive or active transporters, but they're dissolvable in water, so they're really, really easy to transport. The way I remember fat soluble is that it's ADEK, ADEK. I love to sit out on a deck, drink my coffee, read the Bible, or just listen to the birds and pet my dog. Sitting on a deck, ADEK, all right? These are the fat soluble. Anything else is water soluble. So if you remember ADEK, you got fat soluble, everything else is water soluble. Now, what about your water soluble vitamins? Well, they are filtered out by your kidneys. And if you don't need them, you pee them out. That's why your pee is a different color of yellow if you take multivitamins, is because they weren't absorbed, they weren't needed by the body, and so they're peed out as waste. What about fat-soluble vitamins? Well, they get stored in the fat in your body, so you can overdose on A, D, E, and K and have vitamin toxicity because you take too much. So I wouldn't take over the daily recommended allowance unless your physician tells you to do so. Okay? Now, in the large intestine, vitamin K and B are made by our microbiota, and those are going to be absorbed in the large intestine. So pretty cool. You can take vitamins in by eating, and then your little bacteria will make vitamin K and vitamin B. Stop and think about this. Vitamin K is necessary for blood clotting. Vitamin B is necessary for making red blood cells. Is it not amazing? I know I keep using that word. That God put bacteria in our guts that make the vitamins that we need so that we don't bleed to death, and vitamins that we need to make red blood cells to be healthy. It's just wow. Just wow. It's just Yeah, cool. So what about our electrolytes? Most ions are going to be transported actively along the intestine. Iron and calcium are absorbed mainly in the duodenum. Sodium absorption is actively absorbed with glucose and amino acids. And then, of course, what always follows sodium? Water. Chloride is transported actively. Potassium is simple diffusion, mainly along with water. So iron and calcium can be absorbed depending on your need. Iron is stored in the mucosal cells by ferritin. You need to couple iron and ferritin. And then when iron is needed, it is going to be attached to transferrin, and transferrin will dump it into the blood, take it to the liver via the hepatic portal system, and then the liver will process it so that it can go to the bone marrow where your blood cells are made. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. Calcium is going to be absorbed in the small intestine, but it's regulated by vitamin D and parathyroid hormone. And remember that vitamin D is fat soluble. And so when you take your calcium and your vitamin D pills, please eat something with fat in it so that your body can absorb it appropriately. You're going to absorb 9 liters of water a day. Whoa! No wonder we gotta pee. And of course, the more you drink water, iced tea, coffee, whatever, wow, you're going to absorb a little bit more. Notice that 95% is absorbed by osmosis, and then the rest gets absorbed into the large intestine. Water is also going to be absorbed whenever sodium is absorbed by the small intestine or by the kidneys. Water will be absorbed because water always follows sodium. What are some of the problems that we see in absorption? We see malabsorption, and underneath that is gluten-sensitive enteropathy, or celiac disease. Malabsorption can be caused by a lot of different things that interferes with bile or pancreatic juice. Sometimes the intestinal mucosa gets damaged by bacteria, toxins, and antibiotics. But probably as far as a disease, the most common one is celiac disease or gluten-sensitive enteropathy. Entero means intestines, pathy means disease, so disease in the intestines. And this is an autoimmune response to gluten. And basically what happens is that the immune response damages the brush border. And so there aren't enough brush border enzymes. They don't have a place to work, and so macromolecules don't get broken down into the monomers, and so since there are no monomers, they can't be absorbed. So you don't have proper digestion in the small intestine, therefore there's nothing to absorb. And what works best is just take gluten out of the diet. And that's what helps the most. So this ends